Immediate 34 in the legislature in Guam is called to order. For the prayer this morning, can I ask Senator Mary Camacho Torres to lead us in prayer? Senator Muñe, if you'd lead us in the Guam hymn, and Senator Snogestein, if you'd lead us in the national anthem. Thank you.
Let us pray in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, through whom all things are possible, in this time of great expectation and joy and anticipation during the month of May, the month where many of our children will graduate at all levels of their education. This is the month of the mothers who bring us life and hope and goodness. Bless also our elderly, as May is also the month of senior citizens. We ask you, dear Father, to guide the leaders as we embark on another session for the month of May. Keep our minds open to always doing what is good for our people and what is good in your name. We also ask your special blessings on one of our colleagues, Senator Tom Atta, who's celebrating his birthday. May he always find joy and good health throughout this coming year. Keep us safe, dear Father. Give us wisdom. But most of all, keep our hearts happy so that we will always have a clear vision in our choices ahead. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.
For the recognition of the recipient of Iminat Lads Mastakulu, na Sacrificio, Senator Lee, you are recognized.
On behalf of the grateful island and country, we honor Seaman First Class Jose Cruz Concepcion, World War II, and the family of Seaman First Class Jose Cruz Concepcion for making the ultimate sacrifice in service and defense of our island and country.
If you would please lead us in the Inifresi.
Inifresi. Gidinimas takulu ginasoku, imas takulum gikurasonhu, zanimas figu nanina senyahu, hu ufresen maisadzu para bai protehi, zanu defendi, ihinengi, ikutura, ilingwahi, I aidi, I hanum, zanitanu tumoru, niren shaku diretsu ginenas duas tata, estiu fitma, gihilui biblia, zani benderahu, I benderan guahan.
you. Clerk, please take roll.
Senator Atta. Senator Uggan. Senator Castro. Speaker Cruz. Senator Aspaldon. Senator Esteves. Senator Lee. Senator Morrison. Senator Muñoz. Senator Nelson. Senator Rodriguez. Senator San Augustine. Senator Nicholas. Vice Speaker Terlahi. Senator Torres. Mr. Speaker, there is a quorum.
I note the presence of Senator Morrison and Senator Rodriguez. Thank you. Mr. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move to approve the Legislative Journal dated April 23rd, 2018, subject to corrections.
On the motion to approve the Legislative Journal dated April 23rd, 2018, hearing no objections, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, there are communications and petitions, and I move that they be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion that the communications and petitions be appended to today's session journal, hearing no objection, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, there are messages from Imagalahin Guahan, and I move that they be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion, the messages from Imagalahin Guahan be appended to today's legislative journal, hearing no objections, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, there are reports of standing committees, and I move that they also be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion, reports of standing committees be appended to today's session journal. Hearing no objections, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, there are no reports of select committees.
Thank you. You may proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I move that bills introduced, bill numbers 276-34LS and 277-34 through 287-34 COR, resolutions introduced, resolution numbers 390-34LS through 403-34LS and 404-34 COR through 432-34 COR, and certificates introduced, certificate numbers 239-34LS through 245-34LS and 246-34 COR through 252-34 COR be deemed to have been given their first reading.
On that motion, hearing no objection, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, I move to excuse senators not present for today's legislative session.
On that motion, hearing no objections, motion carries.
I move that all congratulatory, commendatory, and condolence resolutions and legislative certificates introduced today and for the remainder of this legislative session be considered first read and adopted, to allow the Legislative Council to make technical corrections and to add all senators as co-sponsors.
On that motion, hearing no objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I move, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to place Bill number 215-34 as corrected by the prime sponsor on to the session agenda.
On that motion, is there any objection? The report has been filed. It has not been uploaded yet, but it has been filed. 215 is, please read the title.
Bill 215 is an act to amend Guam Code Annotated, relative to creating a Guam Ancestral Lands Commission Survey, Infrastructure, and Development Fund from the lease proceeds of leases of Apra Harbor Reservation F12 and parcel N14-1, which is the Polaris Point parcels, and to authorize uses of these funds. The enactment of this bill would allow basically the funding of the GALC operations using GALC revenues.
On that motion, is there an objection? Hearing none. Motion carries. Any other motion? Senator Lee, you're recognized.
Sutus Masi, Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules from the Committee on Innovation and Economic, Workforce, and Youth Development, I move to place the appointment of Ernesto V. Espaldon Jr. to serve as a member of the Guam Economic Development Authority GIDA Board of Directors onto the session agenda.
On that appointment motion, any objection? Anyone? Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Notwithstanding the House rules, as we've discussed in our rules meeting earlier regarding this session, I'd like to make a motion to place Resolution 311-34 onto the session agenda.
That's been uploaded. No objection. Mr. Majority Leader, do you also have an appointment? Oh, Senator Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to make a motion to move Bill number 203-34 as substituted by the Committee on Culture and Justice. It's an act to amend and move Chapter 18, Title 16, Guam Code Annotated, to Chapter 92, Title 9, Guam Code Annotated, and relative to the Safe Streets Act of 2018. I'd like to move that on to the second reading.
Any objection? Hearing none.
Thank you.
Mr. Majority Leader.
I guess we're on legislative concurrence.
Do you have one appointment? Did you want to move on?
Oh, well, yeah, but in the legislative concurrence, that's where I'll put it on.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. So, Mr. Speaker, I move to place the following from the Committee on Environment, Land, Agriculture, and Procurement Reform. Hereby reports out the nomination of Michael E.D. Uggan to serve as the district director of the Southern Guam Soil and Water Conservation District Board, with the recommendation to do confirm to be placed in the voting file.
Hearing no objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I move to place from the Committee on Innovation and Economic, Workforce, and Youth Development, the nomination of Ernesto V. Espaldon Jr. to serve as a member of the Guam Economic Development Authority Board of Directors, with a recommendation to do confirm to be placed in the voting file.
Hearing no objection, so ordered.
Okay.
That's it? Okay. We are in second reading. Senator Snogestein, you're recognized on Bill 159.
Mr. Speaker, I move to place Bill 159-34 COR, amended by the committee, on the third reading file. I'd like to discuss it.
Hearing no objection, you may proceed. You're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, Bill 159 aims to extend the duty of a parent or guardian to enroll children in school until they are 18 years old. Current law allows minors to leave school at 16 with no diploma and fewer skills to succeed. According to the United States Department of Education, dropouts are more than twice as likely as college graduates to live in poverty. A 2007 study by Northeastern University found higher rate of unemployment, incarceration, and single parenthood among dropouts ages 16 to 24 than their peers with diplomas. Our community pays the cost when a young person leaves school without a diploma. The days when you could find a good job at 16 with no education or skills are over. Bill 159 updates public law to reflect the changing times. Parents and guardians have a duty to ensure minors under their jurisdiction receive a full education and have every chance at the best future.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard on this main motion? On the main motion? Any senator wish to be heard? Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to stand in support of this bill and commend the sponsor on it. This bill is also a bill that has been passed by the Youth Congress, and we had social workers come and testify on it, and they stated the same reasons as the sponsor, that this bill is important, and studies are showing us that the success of our children is really dependent on whether they finish school, and it impacts, as the sponsor said, incarceration and poverty most of all. And for those reasons, I support this bill. I am concerned that there are some concerns that were brought up during the hearing that were not addressed, and these concerns are actually even brought up by Superintendent of DOE and the board members, and those are the need for additional resources that he stated. They would need necessary facilities, teachers, staff, and classroom resources to serve these students. And that raising the compulsory age to 18 means that we must be sure that we are not just creating a way station for an extra 2 years for students who are struggling or failing at school. It's my understanding that the J.P. Torres Success Academy it's at capacity, and that there's a very high demand to get in there, and they've been becoming increasingly selective, and they have a vetting process as to who can get in, and kind of based on motivation. So I just, I think there are things that DOE is going to have to deal with in order to allow these students who may have shown a lack of interest in school previously, if they are brought back in, because they might not be able to get into the J.P. Torres Academy with their current vetting process. We're not sure about those things. That remains to be seen, how they will deal with this increased population. There was also testimony that the underlying reasons for the dropout rate, or especially at the age of 16, are really not being addressed, and I just want to state for the record that those remain concerns, and they're not necessarily addressed in this bill, and that perhaps we need to look at increasing support services to address these reasons why the students are dropping out. I think one of the testimonies talked about increasing counselors to make sure that we address the problem. And the bill as amended, I just noticed this morning, has removed the fine for the first offense, the $50 fine, and removed that petty misdemeanor charge for subsequent violations, and it's replaced that with parents are going to be now liable for, I think, so many hours of community service instead of the fine and instead of the petty misdemeanor charge. I'm not sure about that either. I think I would like to hear additional, maybe from the courts. I'm just not sure how much motivation that will be for parents, whether, to put their child in school or force them. How do you force a 16-year-old into school by putting the parents into community service? I think we need to put some more services into the schools and into perhaps like counseling for at-risk for the parents. So perhaps maybe the courts will be amenable to including at-risk services for these parents. So how to deal with these students so that we can further support them. And I want to commend the sponsor for the additional change in the committee that allowed them, that made the exception for if they had already achieved the required credits for graduation before the age of 18, that they did not need to stay in there further, because that was another concern. So that's been amended and for the better. So I just wanted to state those concerns for the record, and thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Nicholas. And then Senator Munya.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The intent to ensure that we have as many students graduating as possible is, of course, an important goal that we must always embrace. I am concerned that the amendments to the bill that we're now entertaining may have an unintended consequence. For example, on lines 34 to 35, the striking through of the offense resulting in a person being guilty of a petty misdemeanor. This section of law doesn't just speak to the dropout age or to those students who are over the age of 16 or into the age of 18, but it also speaks to truancy. If your child is in elementary school and you're not sending them to school, and you're in violation of this section that spells out that you have a duty to send your children to school, that one line in there, which is existing law, would make the violation a petty misdemeanor. Striking that through will have the unintended consequence of making there be no judicial consequence for not following this particular part of the statute. And so by replacing that with community service, also that does not have any kind of statutory consequence for not adhering to it. If you don't send your child to school and you rack up all these community service hours that you never go in and serve, then technically you will have an inconsequential environment in which children may be more truant and nobody will have any kind of penalty. It'll be on paper, but the enforcement of it, the application of it would really be, it wouldn't have any teeth. They wouldn't be guilty of any kind of actual misdemeanor because we've struck in that section through. So I'd like to perhaps reserve my time for a later point of the discussion and perhaps yield to the author if he may clarify whether or not these concerns have any basis. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Senator Munya.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also, too, rise in support of this measure, and I thank the author for introducing it. As a parent of a recent graduate who also was 18, I do believe that us as parents should still have that opportunity to continue to allow our children to go all the way up till 18. Now, I know there are some concerns like how do you force a 16-year-old to go to school if they don't want to? I believe it's the exact same way as you force a 15-year-old or a 14-year-old. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, they're still minors up until the day they turn 18. And so I still believe that they should have that opportunity and there should be consequences to it if they don't. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Senator Camacho Torres, and then any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Uggan. I'm sorry. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On its face, there's no doubt that we should keep our children in at least till age 18 or upon graduation from high school, at the very least. But in reading the committee report, although there was overwhelming support in favor of this bill, what caught my attention, in addition to some of the issues raised by one of the previous speakers about Department of Education's testimony, what concerned me about the whole scenario is, one, what are the options for added resources to accommodate children who either have dropped out and now will be compelled to come back into the system? But also, DOE brought up another very valid point, which is what do we do about the students who really don't want to be in school? And for me, in reading that, it begs the question of, you know, are you creating a situation where you may subject other students to a person who really is not conducive to a good atmosphere for the class in general? You know, there's that old notion that one bad apple can rot the whole bunch, and also one bad apple can also set the tone for a very bad environment in a school. But at the very least, I think there's some concerns that I have with this bill, and my hope is that it can be vetted further, because I think that there are so many moving parts here to it being successful. One, for example, is Guam has an extremely high teenage pregnancy rate, and I'm aware that many students who drop out as a result of being young mothers who don't have the support to care for their children, so they themselves have to support their children at least during the infancy years before they can go to some daycare. So that is one concern that you know, is very real in terms of compelling somebody to go back to school immediately or to stay in school. Another is we have to ensure that if we have alternative situations for those students who don't fit within the scheme right now and drop out as a result, that there is alternative schooling for them. And the other thing that concerns me is I believe that we don't want to penalize people who don't have money by fining them, and that I understand, but requiring people to perform community service could also be another form of unreasonable punishment for a parent. So I believe that if we were to have an option of how to penalize parents for not complying with this law, then we should at least give them the option. Some people don't have money and would perform community service. Some people don't have the ability to perform community service because of other obligations, but may want to opt for a fine. So I think that option should be afforded to them. But I do worry, Mr. Speaker, that all good intentions sometimes need the backing of resources and a solid plan of action so that we can implement it successfully. And I believe that this is one piece of legislation that maybe needs to be massaged further, and that the concerns that were raised by the Department of Education in their testimony needs to be addressed. How do we afford the schools with the resources necessary to now educate these children who have otherwise dropped out and are coming back in? And how do we provide for those troubled students who need an alternative type of education when our system right now, what we have right now, is full and could use added resources? So I would ask the author if he would very graciously consider whether this bill can go back to committee so that we can provide for it, because we would want at the very least for it to be successful, to have a statute that says you must stay in for until you're 18 years old or have graduated, or we just want to provide for that. I'm sorry, I lost my name. But if he would be so gracious as to consider that we have the moving parts in place before this statute is actually implemented, I think that would serve our community in the most optimal way. Si Dios ma'asi.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Argan?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Zen buenas and half a day to you and our colleagues. Mr. Speaker, you know, it's kind of interesting how times have changed. because about 16 years ago, if my memory serves me correctly, there was a piece of legislation that I had introduced and sponsored that would have increased the compulsory age from 16 to 17. And back then, the vice speaker from NCS was the chair of education. He had a public hearing. I did request that, in fact, they have a public hearing where the community can access and provide testimony. Well, we held it in the evening, and lo and behold, a majority of individuals that provided testimony were teachers. And they were concerned about some of the perspective that has been mentioned here, that if these students beyond the age of 16 do not want to be in school, then why should we force them to? And I bring us to today, where we're entertaining a measure that would require a compulsory age from 16 to 18. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I stand here in support of the concept, because to me, it's not about keeping these children in school for a few more years. It's about ensuring that we instill in the minds of our students that at a very minimum, you should get a high school diploma. At a very minimum, our students should get a high school diploma. And I say that because in order to be employed in the government of Guam, what is the minimum education requirement? A high school diploma. In order to enter into the military, if in fact that's the option of some of these students coming out of high school, minimum educational requirement is a high school diploma. A number of businesses out there in the community, in the private sector, some of their minimum educational training requirements is a high school diploma for entry-level jobs. And I look at it from that perspective, Mr. Speaker, not insisting and requiring that these students stay in school, but these students stay focused on why they are in school. They are in school to get a high school diploma, which is a prerequisite to start off employment if in fact that's the choice of the students to go directly into the workforce. So I stand here, certainly, Mr. Speaker, in support of the concept, because to me it's best that we continue to encourage and to guide these students with the support of our educational system, the superintendent to the certified teacher in the classroom, that we continue to encourage these students to get at a very minimum their high school diploma so that they can acquire employment, or other options is certainly to pursue a degree either at Guam Community College or at the University of Guam. So, Mr. Speaker, I stand with those particular statements. Thank you very much, and Dr. Masi.
Thank you. Senator, any other member wish to be heard on the motion? On the main motion, Senator Espaldon. Senator Nicholas, I still remember that you're...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I think it's been iterated that there's a lot of support for this concept, and I understand. The law in itself, there was and if I could probably pose a question to the author of this legislation, and the question is that on page 2 under section 6102, the duty to send children to school, bottom line on page, on line number 32, well, let me just read it, starting on line number 28 to line number 32. It reads, any parent, guardian, or other person having control or charge of any such child who is at least 5 years of age and has not reached the age 18 years, that's the new part of the law, who fails to comply with provisions of this section unless excused or exempted therefrom, is guilty of a violation for each offense. The law right now, it says, is guilty of a violation for the first offense. I guess the question I need to pose is what is an offense? Each offense, how many offenses can actually be accumulated? If a parent does not send a child to school or for a certain day or a week, is that an offense? And that is what they're guilty for? Or is it for them just not enrolling them for that school year? Is that the offense? Because when you talk about each offense, I guess the question is, how many offenses and what offenses can be accumulated? What is the offense? Not sending the child to school on a particular day or a week or a month? Or is it not sending a child to school for the whole year? I don't know. And if the author would perhaps clarify, I'd appreciate that.
Senator Augustine, do you yield? I understand you've been bombarded with questions back there, and I'm not sure if you heard the question.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, Senator, on line number 28, all the way to, I guess that's the last sentence, and it goes all the way to line 34. Bottom line, a change is being made to the law. The law presently says that if you don't send your child to school up to the age of 18, they're guilty of a violation for, right now the law is for the first offense. The law is now, this bill now attempts to change the law to say each offense. I guess in my mind is like, how many offenses can this actually rack up? What kind of offenses are we talking about? Just the act of not sending a child to school? And for 1 day or for 1 week or 1 month?
Let me answer that.
Okay.
Okay. We need to first understand, number one, in the schools, when a child is absent, there's a process. There's a truant officer. They go and they investigate, find out what happened to the child. After so many days, there's the truancy. There's a process. By the time it's identified that the individual actually, the student just didn't come to school, has been skipping out, then they find out from the parent. That's the process. There's the investigation. Normally, it normally takes about 2-3 months when they finally recognize that the kid is not sick. He's been maybe forging his parents' signature that he's sick and all. There's a process. So to determine the offense, we're only looking at if they determine that you didn't abide by the law to be in school, then they get a hold of the parents and they say, today, just to let you know, my colleagues, there's a program in the schools today and they call shadowing. So it's almost the same as community service. Parents are required to shadow their child in school. This will just actually extend it to 100 hours when it's determined that the parents failed to make sure their child is in school. That's the key here.
Okay.
Is that satisfactory, sir?
Well, I suppose he did. It's still not clear with me because through that explanation, of course, there was a situation that was brought up in the example that if the child does not go to school on his own volition, then again, after a while, I guess truancy becomes the issue. Whether or not the parent sends the child to school up to the age of 18, right? They might be expecting that child to be going to school, might even be dropping them off at the doorstep of the school. If the child leaves the school and constantly does that, then it's the responsibility of the parent to perform now, not just pay a fine, but to basically perform 100 hours of community service at the school of the student. And I suppose that would be, I don't know, at the finding of the school, that the parent probably should have made sure that the student went to class. And then to penalize the parent for the child's behavior, even though the parent went all the way to dropping the child at the front of the door of the school, right, now becomes subject to 100 hours worth of community service. And then every time that happens, that occurs, then I guess that just adds up. And a previous colleague of ours mentioned, well, there's no consequences, that should that all of a sudden become the policy of the school, or the penalty is imposed upon the parent. There is nothing here that says that if the parent doesn't perform, then what is the alternative? I just bring that up for a matter of thought. I do appreciate that answer. I'm not really sure of it, but thank you.
Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Estevez. I see Senator Camacho Torres' hand up again, and I know that Senator San Nicolas wants to speak, but Senator Estevez, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this measure. I do share some of the concerns with my colleagues about, and I really believe we're maybe getting into the weeds a little too much, and we can go and spin our wheels as to, is 100 hours of community service adequate? Is 150 hours, 200 hours? Is it per se correct that the parent be penalized for the actions of their child? And Mr. Speaker, I'm of the mindset that yes, that child is still a minor. And if the parent can't be held responsible for the actions of the child, who will? At the end of the day, it's still a minor. Mr. Speaker, I am in agreement, and I am going to be proposing an amendment, because I do believe that as it is originally intended in the law, that the offense makes the person guilty of a petty misdemeanor, I think is crucial, which was crossed out in this. And I think that's important, because if there is a statutory violation attached to this bill, then I think that opens up resources that the courts can provide. I think the courts would probably be better suited to work with the parent and work with the child with the resources they have available, whether that be enforcement at the truancy level down with the truancy officers in the school to ensure that the judge's orders are complied with, and working with the parents to ensure that maybe 50 hours is something amicable, so that a parent can both pay that back to the community for the disruption of their child at 50 hours and still be able to meet the requirements of their full-time job and bring in a paycheck. And I think in just establishing very general guidelines and not allowing the courts to partake in this process, I think would be a detriment to the families that we're looking to benefit. You know, I have concerns with some of the things being said here, and I do understand that maybe I'm not understanding it correctly. But I want us to be very, very careful with some of the things that we may be considering, that a 16-year-old really has the choice, or that we should really be basing our legislation, or maybe how we're approaching this, at the behest of what a 16-year-old may want, what a minor may want. Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Speaker, as an employer, I'll tell you right now, a 16-year-old coming to me looking for a job without a high school diploma, with the mindset that at 16 they should only be doing the things that they want to do, I would not be interested in hiring that individual. We're supposed to be preparing our youth, Mr. Speaker, for the real world. And in the real world, many times we're forced with doing things we don't want to do. And I think setting the bar now and saying until you reach the age where you're an adult and you become legally responsible for the decisions you make, for the things you do, for the things you fail to do, I think is important. And that's why I stand with this legislation. Now, the amendment I do propose, Mr. Speaker, is that starting on page 2, on line 34 and 35, as previously crossed out, and as it currently reads, crossed out, for each subsequent offense, the person is guilty of a petty misdemeanor. Mr. Speaker, I propose, and my amendment is that we add that back in and we don't cross that out. And we allow the courts to participate in this process and use all the resources available to best work with the families and their individual cases. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The amendment proffered by Senator Estevez is to reinstate line 34 and 35, the part that's been crossed out. Any senator wish to be heard on the amendment? Again, the amendment being proffered by Senator Estevez is on line 34 and 35 to remove the strikeout and to reinstate that last sentence as a petty misdemeanor. Any senator wish to be heard? Senator Uggan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I guess the question that I would have, Mr. Speaker, if the Chairman of Education has a response, is if in fact the existing law has ever been used in our public educational system, because that's really a good place to start as to whether this provision should be struck out in exchange for community service. So if by any chance he has information to that effect, if not, then certainly I would consider other options. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Do you yield?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. During the public hearing, quite a few in the community came out and said, parents need to get more involved. That's the reason why I put in the community service. And it's in the school. All we did was expand the shadowing in the schools to be identified as community service. And they asked that you charge a parent for petty misdemeanor, next year you charge them for petty misdemeanor, all it's going to reflect on the parent's record is, I didn't send my child to school because they believe it was a violation. Ladies and gentlemen, it's about the child. It's about getting the parents, bring your child to school from 16 to 18 and help them get an education. Convince them that it's important because it ruins the parent's career.
Thank you. On the amendment, any other senator wish to be heard? No? Any objection to the amendment? Objection. It's been an objection by the, please.
Thank you for the opportunity to close, Mr. Speaker. If I can just highlight the intent of the amendment. So as it currently reads, now, I'm probably going to add another amendment pending the outcome of this, but if you were to read it as previously with line 32, the first offense would have been subject either to a fine, in this instance it's $100. But in terms of the timeline or the process that I'm interested in, Mr. Speaker, is that after a parent may have been subject to 100 hours of community service, then there needs to be teeth in if it continues. Now, the offense being subject as a petty misdemeanor opens up a whole slew of different options for the courts to provide, whether that's additional community service, whether that's fines, or any other options that they may be able to do to work with that parent for the benefit of the child. But at the end of the day, if the law is telling me I have 100 hours of community service and I don't provide them, considering it's not really a crime, yes, it's a violation of the law, but there's no teeth in it and it's not a crime, what's going to compel me to do it? What is going to bring me before the judge for him to compel me as a parent to do the community service or to send my child to school? And that's kind of what I'm curious about here. And if somebody with some experience in this can assist me and maybe provide that information.
Is there someone you would like to yield to that question? Mr. Speaker, would you yield to the question?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I served 10 years as the family court judge with this provision in the law, and I don't recall ever imposing a fine or insisting on a criminal case being filed. One of the earlier senators made mention of the fact that it would affect the parents' record and ability to be able to support and sustain the family. And I know many of you don't like it when I use the B word instead of using the parents word, but really seriously, I don't know how to be able to control that. I wish I could have when I was there 10 years, but some people just have them and have no idea what the responsibilities of parenting are to be able to raise the child, to understand the importance of education, and complying with rules. And so I don't know how to be able to control that. I tried for 10 years. If I had my way, I was told I was fascist, but I can't impose those kinds of fines and order certain things to be done. And so I really ask us to consider the fact that the community service and the shadowing that the sponsor mentioned was the way that I was able to get the parents involved and had them. I thought that the embarrassment of a 16-year-old walking into class with mother or with daddy, having to sit in the back of the class and to make sure that you show up would be enough. And with some cases it worked, with others it didn't. It just wasn't going to happen. And but I never imposed the fine, and I never asked for a criminal filing because I didn't want to further exacerbate the dire conditions of that family to begin with, and then not being able to bring in a clean police report, even if it is just a petty misdemeanor. It still is a record, and so I tried to be cognizant of that during those 10 years. Though if I had my way, I'd impose heavier sanctions, but was told it was illegal.
Senator Esteves.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I think that highlights a couple of points that I made. You know, it has been existence in law, and maybe at times it was enforced, and maybe other times it wasn't. One thing of note that I would like to state is now it is current law that a person doesn't need to produce a police report when applying for a job, and that comes after the fact, so it's not discriminatory against them. But that's beside the point, Madam Speaker. I think the point is we just need to get hard on this. We want parents to be involved in the education of their child. And we want children to understand how important education is. And part of the things that we have and part of the tools we have at our disposal is not only having a criminal penalty assigned to this, but I believe enforcing that and saying we are very serious that education is important for our children. Education is important on this island, not just for the people who have grown up on Guam, but even for the individuals coming to the island looking for better opportunities, that we take education very important. We invest a lot of money, Madam Speaker, into our education system. It accounts for a majority of our budget. And I think part of one of the minimal responsibilities of the parent is to ensure that their children are going to school. And so I ask my colleagues to support this amendment. I do believe that it is very important that we have the community service. I think that is definitely more of a holistic approach that we can take. But I really do believe that there needs to be teeth in this law and that we need to hold parents accountable. And we need to take this very serious because the long-term ramifications and the outcomes, the potential outcomes of that child not receiving the education or not going to school, or even if they make their graduation, missing those vital instructional hours is going to have long-term consequences not only to that child, but to the community as a whole. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
On the bill? I think he was closing.
I believe the speaker raised a point of inquiry with respect to the amendment, and if I could offer some perspective on the inquiry.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I yield.
All right. Senator.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just wanted to point out, there may have never been a charge with respect to this provision being added into the law, we need to also remember that truancy officers or school administrators can still use it when they're communicating with the parent. And they can say, you know, if you don't bring your kids into school, we can take you to court. And oftentimes, being able to just say that is enough to compel a truancy situation to remedy itself without there actually being the charges filed. And so I appreciate the mover of the amendment trying to retain this language because it still empowers the truancy officers and the school administrators to make those factual statements that if you don't comply with this provision of the law, you can be charged with a misdemeanor. You know, if we take it out, they can't say that anymore. But if we leave it in there, then it still becomes one of the tools in the arsenals of our truancy officers and our school administrators to try and compel compliance with the compulsory education law. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Senator Esteves, I believe you closed already?
Yes, and I've completed with my closing, Madam Speaker. Thank you, and thank you to the retiring speaker for contributing to the dialogue.
All right, so on the amendment, the Esteves amendment, there was an objection. So all in favor of the amendment, please raise your hand. Oh, and amendment passes. On the bill?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I had one more amendment. Line 32, as it currently reads, a violation for each offense. Since the amendment just passed, which adds a provision for each subsequent offense, I'd like to scratch or line out the word each and re-implement the word the first.
All right, on the amendment, is there any objection? There's been an objection. Would anyone like to speak on the amendment? All right, there's been an objection. Would you like to close?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And that's, again, to reiterate a process that we're forging here, which is, as was previously stated by previous speakers, if a child or if somebody is found guilty of the offense and violating this, then we start with the holistic approach, which time and time again has proven to work. If that holistic approach does not work, then we assign the penalty to it, which is a petty misdemeanor. And at that point, there are other options available to the courts to try to work with that parent and that family, whether that be additional community service or other arrangements that the courts can make to ensure that the child is going to school. But I think this is vital to the process, and it shows that we do understand that we don't want to place an unnecessary burden on the parent, and that we do appreciate a holistic approach to start with, but at some point we have to get serious, Madam Speaker. And I ask my colleagues to please support this additional amendment. Thank you.
All right, on the Esteves amendment to delete the word each and restore the words the first. All in favor, please raise your hand. Amendment passes. On the bill, Senator Esteves, you're still recognized.
I have nothing further, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleagues for their support.
On the bill, anyone else? All right, Senator Torres, Speaker Cruz?
Madam Speaker, I'd like to proffer an additional amendment. I had spoken previously about accommodating parents when they don't have the ability to perform community hours because of extenuating circumstances, but may be amenable to paying the fine. I'd like to proffer an amendment on line 32 to include the area that's striked out so that it reads on line 32, a violation for the first offense and subject to a fine of not more than $50, subsequent fine. And I'd like to change the word and to or to perform 100 hours community service at the school of the student. What I'm proffering, Madam Speaker, is to reinstate the fine of $50 and give the option of either paying a $50 fine or to perform 100 hours of community service. So that would be my amendment to line 32 and 33.
All right, on the amendment, but Senator San Augustine, you're recognized.
Madam Speaker, I can understand the intent. $50 versus 100 hours? Let's just do the simple math. What is the minimum wage? $8? 8 times 100 is what? $50? I don't think so. Let's match it. We got the 100 hours community service. If we want to put a dollar amount, or it should equal what the community hours is equivalent to. Otherwise, I object to the
On the amendment, Speaker Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I don't really object to the fact that you have a monetary amount or whatever the amount is, but I really do think that in order to be able to use the word parent, and I know many of you had Mother's Day just 2 weeks ago, and so I'm very hesitant to use that word mother or parent with some people. I know many of you are very uncomfortable with my use of the other word, so I won't use it. But really, seriously, it's not an issue of money, and people should not be able to just decide, this is too much trouble, $50, I don't have to deal with them. They brought that child into this world, and they're going to have to sit there and suffer the consequences of attending 5 hours of school for a week or for whatever it takes to make sure that that child attends classes. And just on the bill expanding further, besides trying to deal with the resources needed that DOE asked for these individuals that don't want to attend school, we also have to start thinking about investing in the curriculum of parenting. When I was family court judge, I appeared before the Board of Education numerous times to appeal to start parenting education in elementary levels because of the fact that Fortunately, unfortunately, some of these children are having children in their middle school years, but have no idea of what the responsibilities of parenting are. And I appealed to the board many times about figuring out some way of including into the curriculum the responsibilities of parenting. Because we graduate kids who can go off and become millennial scholars, can do STEM, but have no idea, not one iota of an idea of their responsibility as parents or parenting. We train our children, we graduate them to go to the military, everything. Law school, med school, but have no idea of their responsibility as parents and parenting. That part of the should be included in the curriculum, and unfortunately is not. And I know that sounds strange from the one person in here who has no children, but that's by choice. It's an immense responsibility that I know that I'm too selfish to undertake. But it is something that they have to understand, and we've got to figure out some way of including that in the curriculum if we're going to have children that are no longer going to be wards of the state. Thank you.
Thank you. On the amendment, Senator Esteves.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As a previous speaker had alluded to, I too have concerns with this amendment only because there should be some equity in terms of what we're asking if the intent is that there are teeth on this. I understand we don't want a fine that is, let's say, impossible for some to come up with. But part of the idea, Madam Speaker, and what's been proven time and time again is fines, penalties, jail time, a permanent record. These are scary things. If a parent knows that they might be staring down a $400 or $800 fine or $100 of community service, that's a scary thing. And unfortunately, that's sometimes what it takes to achieve compliance for such a simple request as making sure your child attends school, making sure your child is getting an education. And while I do agree that 100 hours could be difficult for some parents, I think $50 as a subsequent fine would be a little too simple if we're trying to get serious on the education of our children, Madam Speaker. So I'm not against the option and the intent that the mover of the amendment has, and at this time I'll allow the amendment to carry forward to a vote. I have no objection at this time in its current form, but I do reserve the opportunity to come back and address it in a different amendment, what that number should be. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. On the amendment, Senator Torres.
Madam Speaker, I'll withdraw the amendment. It didn't occur to me, but in listening, it's true. If we were to attach the option in the way that it's so inequitable right now, it would only prove to penalize the poor person over the person with greater means. So I withdraw that amendment.
All right. On the bill, Speaker Cruz, you're recognized on the bill. Speaker Cruz, you're recognized on the bill.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Speaker. Like one of the earlier speakers, I too recall that in my first term here, I introduced legislation to raise the compulsory age. And at that point, there were several members of the legislature who had three-letter terminal degrees and would remind me that mine was a two-letter terminal degree as opposed to a three-letter terminal degree. And I did not understand education and should stay in my lane. And so the bill didn't get very far. But I, like the sponsor of the bill, and many of those that rose in support of the bill, understand the importance of this and the desire, I mean, for all of us to see to it that at the minimum, our children receive a high school diploma so that they meet the basic prerequisites of government employment or entry into the military. Because to be precluded from either one of those really leaves you almost nothing. So I understand that need, but it starts earlier, and we've got to do something about the educational system. I finally got off the push for increasing the compulsory age and started with the need to have preschool so that the students don't fall behind, because that's where the problem is once the kids fall behind, it's impossible for them to catch up and they just give up. But then again, it's only those of us that have the means to be able to pay the $450 a month or $600 a month for preschool, that have the children in preschool or are fortunate enough to be eligible for GATE or some other special program. But the investment in education has to be made at a very early age, and the investment in teaching parenting and parenting responsibilities has to be made. And so I support this bill, as imperfect as it is, as a way of at least making a statement from this body that it is our determination that the compulsory age should be increased. And we'll have to, as a community, figure out how to give them the adequate resources to take care of those who are at the tail end, who are the 14, 15, 16-year-olds that are threatening to drop out, so that we can prepare them in kindergarten, first and second, so they don't fall behind by third and give up. Thank you.
Thank you. On the bill, Senator Castro, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Initially, I wanted to reserve comment, thinking that being a co-sponsor to the measure would be sufficient to reflect my position on the bill. And second, especially because Senator San Agustin, the prime author, in my opinion, did a good enough of a job articulating the legislative intent. But after listening to the previous speakers and being an educator, I just couldn't help but scramble some notes and share my thoughts. And while it may not reflect the prime author's feelings or sentiments on the measure, I think that I just want to provide my opinion for the record. And so my first position would be, passage of this measure is important because it signals to the community our position as a community about the value of education. I think the statistics will tell us, but you can never say it enough, that the higher the amount of education one gets, the greater earning power. But I think we tend to leave out, and not by choice, But we tend to forget that the lower the education somebody has, Madam Speaker, the more likely they are to be unemployed. And so there's a correlation there. I think 2 or 3 previous speakers hammered it down best, but it reflects my sentiment as well, that the passage of this measure, Madam Speaker, reflects our community's position, that as a parent or a legal guardian, that they have to rise to the occasion to be responsible for keeping a child in school for as long as possible until they're able to determine for themselves an alternate path to being contributing members of this society. Granted, I can't speak to the literature on the issue of truancy or what juveniles do, at a certain age with a lack of an education, but I can speak as a parent. I certainly can speak as an educator, and I certainly can speak as a member of my village, Barragata, as part of the Neighborhood Watch program. If the statute doesn't allow minors to walk around at a particular time of day, specifically curfew, it's for good reason. The statistics in my neighborhood would tell you definitively that those who are contributing or committing crimes are those under the age of 18 or between 14 and 17 during the curfew hours. That's a lack of parenting. And I think, and I would stand to be corrected, I think that the judicial system does a fine job holding those parents or treating those minors when they become adults responsible for some kind of remuneration for paying back the damage to society. I was the victim of 2 unauthorized break-ins, and so I think I can speak firsthand from my perspective. So if our statute doesn't allow them to walk around, why are we allowing them then to decide at 16, our young adults? I'm the father of 4 children. I don't even allow my kids to decide when they can wake up on a school day. They will be up. We try our best as parents, as members of the same household, to encourage each other to get up at a certain time. So why should we allow them to drop out of school? To the issue of community service and shadowing. Well, I think shadowing is a tool. I really commend the author for including in his measure here the need to provide community service. And I can speak as a teacher. I remember seeing a student, definitely more than one, with a parent shadowing him or her. And in one not so productive case, as a previous speaker alluded to, the parent brought a book and sat very conveniently in the corner reading her book while the child was in class. In another very extreme example, one parent even ran in with the child, who unfortunately went on into high school to break other school rules, and ran into my class during the break period asking if they can hang out during my prep period. A parent who was just released from prison. Of course that was unacceptable and I didn't allow it. But I can also speak from my personal perspective of my young child below the age of 18 as having broken a school rule at a public school. And I could have conveniently opted for the suspension, a 3-day suspension, but what I did was I went and I shadowed my son. And there was a change in behavior. And yes, the shadowing component of a set of rules within the Department of Education is an effective tool when applied appropriately. But I really think that Senator San Augustine is on the mark when he's going to require people to pay service and tribute back to the community, to pay that sacrifice of time and effort, not necessarily money, although I'm not in objection to that. Because the community itself, when there's an infraction upon us, whether it's the destruction of property or people's lives being adversely affected, there's a sacrifice on the community. When parents aren't good parents and legal guardians aren't bearing their responsibility and extending the love. And so, Madam Speaker, I just want to close by stating and restating for the record that I rise in support of this measure. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. On the bill, is there any other senator who wishes to speak on the bill? If not, then the sponsor may close. He doesn't. All right, so we will, on the motion to place Bill 159 on third reading, all in favor, please raise your hand. Oh, sorry, there's no objection, so it's on third reading. Thank you. Senator San Augustine, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Speaker, I move to place Bill 160-34 COR, an act to amend subsection I-13 of Section 715, Chapter 7, Title 1, Guam Code annotated relative to converting the 100 instructional days required each school year by the Department of Education. On the third reading file, I'd like to discuss it.
Hearing no objection, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bill 160 would amend public law to change the required unit of attendance at Guam Public Schools from 180 instructional days to 1,260 instruction hours, or 900. This measure converts calendar days into actual hours spent in the classroom. It enables the school to make up any lost instruction hours in a more efficient manner. The loss of partial day to utility outage or safety concerns would no longer count as an entire lost day. Instead, make-up days will coincide with the actual amount of instructional times lost. We crafted this bill with input from Guam DOE, and the unit of measurement is more in line with the school system's goals and requirements. It's a simple change that schools can tailor to meet the needs of their students, faculty, and staff. And Mr. Speaker, I was looking over the bill, and the bill had line out the unintentionally on page 2, lined out middle school and high school. I'd like to ask that an amendment to restore what was lined out be put back in, because it was supposed to identify that elementary is 900 hours, middle and high is 1,260. It was two separate, but it was administrative oversight where they lined it out. Thank you.
Is that clear? Yeah, you want to repeat that again? Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, on page 2, administratively, we lined elementary school. Elementary was lined when it was supposed to be left there because elementary was to be converted. Instead of 180 days, it was identified that it's 5 hours a day for 180 days, equates to 900 hours. And then on the second line, it said middle school and high school of 7 hours. That is to be restored because that was supposed to reflect 7 times 180 days equals to 1,260 hours. Just restore those two sections back.
So this amendment should just be the underline.
That's
and
correct.
The cross out should be removed and the underlined part reinstated.
That's correct.
Does everybody understand that? That this...
Yeah, the cross out should be underlined.
There should be no double crossing. I mean, it's all there.
If I may just ask the sponsor, then that reverts this bill to its original form. The amendments by the committee there are no other amendments by committee. Is that correct? Okay. All right. Thank you.
Senator Camacho Torres.
Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised that this bill made it to the floor in its format because it doesn't include the line numbers that is required. But I just want to clarify then, we're talking about Section 2, right? Restoring all those areas in Section 2 towards the latter part?
Correct.
Okay, because it's also included in the intent, and I just wanted to make sure that we were capturing everything. All right, but I do want to note it's not the line numbers aren't there, which is very awkward for us to work with.
Was there... Is that clear? The strike-throughs are removed. On the main motion, Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I come from a family of educators. My wife is an educator. I tried being an educator for a little bit. It takes a very special, talented kind of person to be able to do that profession. And while I love the students and I love the opportunity, I think that there are much better teachers out there than I am. But there are certain things that I learned in that capacity. One of them is that you cannot simplify education in terms of hours, and here's why. The school day has students attending different classes at different times. And if we were to just count the hours as having met a certain requirement, you may still be depriving the students of exposure to particular subject matter. For example, as a Guam history teacher, I had students, of course, throughout the day, but if we only had half day, then all of my students for the second half of the day would not have had Guam history for that day. If a school has 10 occurrences over the course of a calendar year where they had to go into half day, those students at the second half of the day would have not had any Guam history classes for 10 instructional days. And so the current system of making up an instructional day requires that the full instructional opportunity is afforded the student. If we were to just break it out into hours, you could technically have so many more half days or count so many more hours or just extend the school day just a little bit to come up with an aggregate number of hours, but it still wouldn't necessarily address the reduced educational exposures to the particular subject matter that was lost as a result of a reduced school day. So I see the intent of the sponsors of this bill, but having the limited experience that I have had teaching in a high school up at Simon Sanchez, I cannot support this bill because just aggregating hours doesn't necessarily equal up to actual educational exposures. And the whole point of us having students go to school for a certain amount of time and having makeup days as a result of certain occurrences is to ensure that the students are getting the education they're supposed to be getting. And so while I can understand the math behind the measure, the actual efficacy of it with respect to educating just doesn't add up. So I'm unable to support Bill 160. I would encourage my colleagues to reconsider. Education is more than just adding up hours. It's actual educational exposures. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. On the main motion, any senators wish to be heard? On the main motion, Senator Torres.
Mr. Speaker, I support this bill because I think it's a practical and sensible way to allow the Department of Education to manage its instructional equivalent of either 180 instructional days or the equivalent. And we do know circumstances on Guam where there could be situations that warrant students to be released early. And the idea that you would have to make up an entire day, if even a portion of that day is interrupted, can be a little bit burdensome. And given the financial constraints of our government and the fact that every day added has a cost component to it, I believe that this is a sensible way for them to manage what they would need to manage in terms of the hours. And I think for the most part, in looking at the committee report, that was essentially the conclusion of the department. And I don't think that it's a detriment. I think that the fact that you can give and take and giving them the flexibility does not sound unreasonable, so long as the instructional hours and days are balanced. So I do rise in support of this bill.
I've been asked by the clerk to make it an official motion that the strike-throughs be reinstated as a motion. If you would.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. If a motion that the strike-throughs be reinstated?
Yes.
That.
On that, any objection to that motion? Hearing none. Thank you. On the main motion, the bill, any other senator wish to be heard? On the main motion? There being none, you're welcome to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleagues, during the hearing, just to let you all know, and it's in the committee report, a lot of the teachers came in, they were actually against the bill. After they heard DOE, board, GFT, and other folks say that it was a great bill, they actually said they withdrew their opposing the bill. So I actually look forward to my colleagues supporting the bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On the bill going to the third, any objection? Hearing none. Senator Adda, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move to place Bill 169-34 COR on the third reading file, and I would like to discuss it.
Hearing no objection, you're recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, Bill 169 proposes to provide tax exemptions for veterans who have been determined by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs to be 100% disabled. It also proposes to provide those tax exemptions for the surviving spouses of these particular veterans, to the legal guardians, and most particularly also to Gold Star spouses and parents. So how many are we talking about? In the year 2017, there was a number of, provided by Department of Revenue and Taxation, 458 veterans who have at least stepped forward to Department of Revenue and Tax to take advantage of fee waivers provided to veterans with 100% rated at 100% disability. I would venture to say that many of these veterans are also at an age where they are provided tax advantages that's not provided to senior citizens. But this bill will most benefit the younger veterans who have returned from the Iraq wars, who are now rated at 100% disability. The timing of this bill is certainly very timely in view of the fact that in this coming Monday, on May 28th, we will be observing Memorial Day for those soldiers who have made the ultimate sacrifice or who have passed away and at one point in their lives certainly provided service to the country. It certainly would be very fitting that we act on this bill favorably, especially to those Gold Star spouses, the surviving Gold Star spouses and parents who lost their loved ones because of a conflict. And so I would just ask my colleagues to favorably consider this bill and provide the tax exemptions for this particular group of veterans. Thank you.
On the main motion, Senator Estevez, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this measure, and I thank the author for introducing it and bringing it to the session floor today. I did, however, have a question if he would yield. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question is if the author of the bill can describe the intent on page 1, line 13, where it reads, or individually unemployable due to military service-connected injuries. And I guess the reason I bring this up is for a veteran who's either rated at, or who's rated at 100% can prove that percentage they're rated at, but I'm just curious how an individual claiming unemployability due to service-connected injuries would be able to prove that to avail themselves to this benefit.
Thank you for that question. It's a good question. Mr. Speaker, in the documentation that's provided by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, they normally would put in there, and actually when we take a look at the law itself, the individual is either 100% disabled because of some physical limitations. Now, they may also be rated as individually unemployable. I can only presume that what that means, of course, and that would be actually printed on that documentation from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. That could be somebody who doesn't have any physical limitations, but certainly an individual with a severe case of, let's say, PTSD, that, you know, just a little bit of pressure and they may be unable to function. So these are the two categories, and they are equated as being 100% disabled.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the author for yielding to the question. I do believe that he is correct. There is a 100% disability rating, and I believe, and I'll take the time to confirm, somebody who is individually unemployable is also 100%. So just because somebody is 100% disabled, has a 100% disability rating, does not necessarily mean they're unemployable. I don't believe this is going to be an issue. Of course, my concern, and I think which brings me up to my next question that I'd like to pose to the author, is his intent on how this would be enforced. We have seen within recent years more issues of people trying to claim or avail themselves of certain benefits that are reserved for veterans. And as we add this benefit for those that have made the sacrifices, surviving spouses, and their legal guardians, is there anything further we can do to ensure that those that are availing themselves to this benefit are verifiable? Are there going to be new rules, perhaps, that we would want either Revenue and Taxation or Department of Veteran Affairs to add to enforce the intent of this law? Is that something, a potential amendment we might be able to look at, or is there something in existing law that already forces all of those things to be done before this can be implemented?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in fact, just last week I was assisting a veteran who went to Department of Revenue and Tax to obtain his special recognition license plate for being a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross Medal. And although he went up there with his DD-214, and it clearly said on there that he is a recipient of that medal, the sad part is that the civilians up at Rev and Tax don't know how to read a DD-214. So what the manager up there simply did was picked up the phone, called Veterans Affairs Office, and asked a verification, you know, how do I interpret this DD-214 and whatnot? And in this case, if this veteran should come up there with this document from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, which says John Doe is rated at 100% disability or individually unemployable, if they don't understand that, there's always, you know, Veterans Affairs Office. Now, we could put in here language that, you know, in addition to all these documentations that he brings up, he still has to go down to the Veterans Affairs Office. And I guess the reason, in fact, it was like that before, and then we've changed the law that says, hey, look, if he brings up the necessary documents that shows that he is a veteran, and so, you know, why does he have to go all the way back down to ASAN to get the guy to say, yes, you are a veteran, when it says right here on the DD-14 that you're carrying a military ID card, you know, so, but that option is always there, to call the Veterans Affairs Office.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that just kind of doesn't necessarily allay some of my concerns. While it's easy to prove almost definitively for a veteran to provide proof that they're a veteran, when we're talking specifically about a disability rating, that's not necessarily as easy as a DD-214 or a card. There's certain documentation, and they provide a letter, a specific letter that provides that rating and that shows that proof. I think my concern is, as we transition into this, when we're looking at the potential revenue, I don't want to make it difficult for those qualified veterans to avail themselves to the services, but what I'm really concerned with is the enforcement or the tracking of this, and for an ineligible veteran or an ineligible individual who's not even a veteran, availing themselves to a program they're not eligible for, I do have concerns with that, because I think it would taint the intent of the bill. And at this time, I'd like to remain committed in my support of this bill. I don't have any amendments at this time, and I think at this point, with the passage of the bill, we'd have to look and just trust that the executive branch and revenue and taxation come up with systems and standard operating procedures in place to ensure that those availing themselves to this exemption are eligible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you to the author of the bill.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Arkin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I certainly stand in support of this provision, but I'd like to inquire with the sponsor, if he would yield, with regards to, let me just first of all frame the context of my question. As it reads on lines 6 through 8, real property owned and occupied as a residence by a person who is rated by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs as 100% disabled due to injuries, and then it continues on. And then provided, where the tax exemption is referenced, the veteran is determined by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs to be 100% disabled or individually unemployable. So my question is this a provision that would provide for veterans with 100% disability, and then applying the or, because individually unemployable, Mr. Speaker, could lead to a veteran having two different disability claims. One perhaps at 40%, another at 40% for different injuries sustained during combat. And as long as it exceeds the 70% all-inclusive by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. So that's really where my question comes in, Mr. Speaker, because if the intent is just 100% individuals, veterans who have been identified with 100% disability, then certainly this would only apply to them. Now, if we're going to take the definition of individually unemployable, it goes back to what I just shared with you. An individual veteran who sustained a 70% plus disability in a combat could be individually unemployable by virtue of the status provided to them by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. So I needed to ask the sponsor, Mr. Speaker, clarification as to the intent of this. Is it just primarily the 100% disability, or is it veterans with 100% disability, or, as it reads in lines 12 and 13, veterans individually unemployable, because they have two different mix and matches in terms of the actual definition, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, just looking up on the internet, individual unemployability is defined as it is a part of the VA's disability compensation program that allows VA to pay certain veterans disability compensation at a 100% rate, even though VA has not rated their service-connected disabilities at the total level. So it is, I don't, you know, I'll admit, I don't totally understand how they rate veterans, but they can either rate you as a 100% disability, and that 100% disability could be the sum of, I guess, various limitations that adds up to 100%, or there's this category of being individually unemployed. But you know, it's part of that VA system.
Thank you very much to the sponsor for providing that information. But it comes back, Mr. Speaker, again to the intent of the legislation, because like I just shared with you, and let me just read off a reference point. To be eligible for the IU, which is individual unemployability benefit, you must be unable to maintain sustainable, gainful employment as a result of service-connected disabilities. Marginal employment, such as odd jobs, is not considered substantial gainful employment for VA purposes. And you must have at least one service-connected disability rated at least 60%, or you must have two or more service-connected disabilities with at least one disability rated at 40% or more, and having all your disabilities combined to give you a rating of 70% or more. So that's why, Mr. Speaker, I think that there really has to be clarification with regards to the intent of the sponsor. If it's 100% disability, an individual veteran can be rated 100% disability with two subject categories. One, with option for employability, still 100% disabled status. The other one is without employment, with employment options as a possibility and without employment. So they have two different subcategories at 100% disability. But like I shared with you, and I just read off the text, individually unemployable has that other definition applied to it. And I was just wondering whether the sponsor, his intent is just those with 100% disability, period, or whether it's inclusive, because he has it on line 13, or individually unemployable, because that's really where the definition is expanded somewhat. So that's why, if in fact, and I'll just close with this, Mr. Speaker, and with the sponsor of the legislation, if in fact his intent was to allow for individually unemployable veterans with that 70% and above to be exempted and to be granted a tax reprieve, then there has to be some clarification on line 7 in terms of the definition or the wording on page 1, and then likewise on page 2 on line 2, just so that in fact is consistent, because it can certainly be misread by individuals who perhaps are not familiar with the veterans rating system. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. On the main motion, Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to rise to a point of personal privilege. The eldest grandson of the St. Nicholas clan, Major Henry St. Nicholas Apashar, he fell in Afghanistan. Antagonist lives right next door to me. I'm going to be requesting for a recusal from a vote on this bill. I will be unable to be impartial on it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the main motion, any other senator wish to be heard? Are there some questions? Should we? Why don't we break for lunch and return at 2?